Welcome to the deep dive. What if the reality we inhabit, the very fabric of existence, isn't just physical or spiritual?
Hmm.
What if maybe beneath all those layers, there's a fundamental legal architecture? And what if the deepest, most significant conflicts aren't really just power struggles or, moral battles, but actually intricate, almost cosmic courtroom disputes?
Well, that's precisely the startling premise of the source material we're plunging into today. It presents a framework for understanding spiritual conflict that's radically different from many traditional views.
Okay.
It calls this unseen conflict the breath war.
The breath war, that definitely makes you pause, doesn't it?
Right.
What exactly is this framework claiming this war is actually about?
So according to these sources we've been given, the breath war is essentially a spiritual legal conflict.
Hmm.
And it centers on the ownership and the control of something called divine breath.
Divine breath.
Yeah, this isn't just the biological process of breathing in and out.
Yeah.
The source material posits that this divine breath, originally issued by God, is actually humanity's fundamental legal identity.
Legal identity.
Yes,
Yeah.
and the very basis of our dominion, our authority over creation.
Wow. Like a sort of cosmic ID card or a legal standing?
Exactly like a legal standing.
Okay.
And the material we're using to explore this, it's drawn from excerpts of a text titled Breath War, the Legal Architecture of the Luciferian Kingdom.
Okay.
And it's presented, interestingly, as an indictment scroll.
An indictment scroll, like in a courtroom.
Precisely. So essentially a document that's detailing the adversary's hidden legal system, how it operates, and the nature of the charges against it, all within this legal framework.
Okay, so that frames everything in terms of a legal case.
Yeah.
So our mission today is really to deep dive into the scroll, these excerpts you've shared, and just, extract the absolute most important nuggets of knowledge.
Right.
We want to understand this complex legal architecture, try and uncover its key concepts, maybe tracing its origins from ancient times all the way through to what it claims are, well, modern technological manifestations.
Yeah, unpacking that whole system.
Right. Our goal is to understand what this unique framework suggests about the unseen conflicts shaping our world, all through this very specific, very legal lens.
Exactly. And you should probably prepare for some surprising insights, things that might fundamentally shift how you view the reality around you and maybe even your place within it.
All right, sounds intriguing. Let's jump right into the foundation then. The source material, it takes us back to Genesis 2.7, where God breathes into Adam. It lays out this core concept, the divine breath as legal foundation, not just biological life.
This is really where everything begins in this framework. When God breathed into Adam, the source posits it wasn't just about giving him biological life as we understand it. It was first and foremost an issuance of legal identity.
An issue.
Think of it like the divine sovereign, signing into existence the first entity with a specific, unique legal standing in the cosmos. And tied directly to that identity was something the source calls occupancy authorization of physical creation.
Occupancy authorization. Okay. Like a divine deed. Or maybe a lease on planet Earth, something like that.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it. The source describes this as the legal foundation of human authority under heaven's registry.
Heaven's registry.
So the universe, in this view, has a kind of legal registry, and man was entered into it via this breath. And this ties directly into what the source terms the Adamic dominion contract.
The Adamic dominion contract.
Yeah, this wasn't just a command like go rule. It was a formal trust structure. God, as the absolute owner of everything, delegated the administration and stewardship of his creation to man.
And this contract, this trust, it was sealed by that breath. Is that the idea?
That's an absolutely crucial point. The divine breath wasn't just the source of life. It was the legal seal upon which Adam's authority and dominion rested.
The seal.
The source emphasizes that the breath was the legal tether, the connection linking man's delegated dominion here on earth back to heaven's sovereign throne and this cosmic registry.
And this tether, this legal standing, it was judicial from the very moment it was issued. It wasn't something Adam had to earn or build up later.
That's right. The source really stresses that this issuance in Genesis 2.7 was judicial. It established man's legal standing in the spiritual courts from that very instant. Without that breath, there was no recognized identity in this cosmic registry, no legal standing, and therefore really no legal basis for dominion over creation.
Okay, so why was having this legal tether, this divinely issued and contained breath, Why was that so incredibly important? Especially when we think about, other spiritual beings.
Well, this is key to the whole war concept, right?
Yeah.
According to this framework, no other spiritual being, doesn't matter if they were loyal angels or fallen entities, had any inherent legal claim to Earth's dominion.
None at all.
Their authority, if they had any, was sort of derivative or limited. They couldn't create breath, which is the source of this legal identity and authority, and they couldn't just directly seize the breath that God had issued to Adam.
So what could they do?
Their only legal strategy, their only pathway, really, to gaining influence or control was to somehow get man, who did hold the legal deed and the tether, to voluntarily compromise or breach that original contract. That would fracture the containment of that legal breath.
Which brings us straight to the fall. Now, we traditionally understand the fall as, primarily a moral failing, right? An act of sin, disobedience against God's command. But this source seems to view it primarily through a legal lens.
It completely reframes the event as a legal transaction. Adam's disobedience, it didn't make the breath disappear. The source is really clear. It did not revoke breath.
Yeah.
Adam still breathed. He still lived biologically.
Okay.
But it did legally compromise the breath. The legal containment around it that tethered to heaven's full judicial protection, it was fractured. So the breath could still function biologically, sustaining physical life, but its full legal standing and protection in the cosmic court were severely weakened.
Ah, okay. So the direct, fully protected legal tether back to heaven's throne was broken, or at least loosened significantly.
Precisely. And this fracturing had immediate and profound legal consequences. It created an immediate opening for competing claims in the spiritual courts.
Competing claims from the adversary.
Yes. It exposed man's dominion, that deed to earth, to the adversary's legal arguments now based on Adam's breach of contract. Even the ground itself being cursed in this framework is seen as a physical manifestation of this legal contract breach impacting reality.
So for you, the listener, thinking about this idea of the fall being fundamentally a legal compromise, a breach of the contract that governed reality, it shifts the focus dramatically, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
It's not just about sin as a personal moral stain, but sin as a violation of a cosmic legal agreement that had tangible effects on the legal structure of the universe and humanity's place within it.
Right. That profound legal vulnerability is where the conflict, this breath war, truly escalates.
It recasts the entire narrative. The moral failure was the means, maybe, to achieve the legal breach.
That's how the source presents it. And this legal vulnerability, this fractured containment of breath, it set the stage for a war fought primarily in the cosmic courtroom.
Okay, and that brings us directly to what the source identifies as the very first escalation of this legal war, what it calls the first fracture and the birth of breath theft, centering on the story of Cain and Abel.
Yes, the source material posits that Cain and Abel weren't just figures in some tragic family drama. They represent the first battlefield on Earth, where these competing legal claims over the now compromised dominion were physically manifested.
They both brought offerings to God, right? And God accepted Abel's but rejected Cain's. The source argues this wasn't just arbitrary favoritism.
No, it ties directly back to the legal contrast established after the fall, according to this view. Abel brought a blood, offering a lamb, which the source interprets as representing righteousness by faith, acknowledging the need for atonement under the new legal reality.
Okay.
Cain, on the other hand, brought fruit of the ground. This is framed as symbolic of self-righteousness, works-based religion, and critically, entitlement, the belief that he deserved favor based on his own effort, not on God's required legal basis post-fall. So God's rejection was essentially a legal judgment on the standing of the offerings within this newly compromised system.
And Cain's reaction, his anger, his resentment, is described as the spark of that very entitlement that would later define the adversary's kingdom.
Exactly. The source calls it the very entitlement that later defines the elite structures of the Luciferian kingdom. And God's warning to Cain, yet sin is crouching at the door. Its desires for you, but you must rule over it. That's interpreted not just as a moral warning, but as God telling Cain he was standing at the doorway of jurisdiction. His choice right then and there would set a legal precedent, impacting not just himself, but future bloodlines.
And then, of course, Cain murders Abel. The source describes this act quite specifically as a transference of blood jurisdiction.
Yes, it's framed as the first unlawful bloodshed upon the earth, not by accident, but as a deliberate legal act in the spiritual realm. Abel's blood crying out from the ground, as described in Genesis, wasn't just, an emotional cry for justice.
What was it then, legally?
The source posits it was because his breath, which still carried a kind of divine legal residue, that trace of original divine issuance and legal standing, was violently and prematurely severed from its vessel, his body.
Hmm.
This act, according to the source, opened a spiritual legal portal for the adversary to lay claim to Cain's seed line.
So this murder wasn't just a horrific act of violence, but actually a legal maneuver in the spiritual courtroom. That's the claim.
Precisely. That's the framework. And from this act, two distinct bloodlines are sort of legally established. Seth, carrying the lineage of righteous seed, connected back to the original registry, and Cain's bloodline, now legally polluted and marked, becoming the archetype of the rebellious seed line used by the adversary.
And this Cain and Abel dynamic, this legal fracture between, say, entitlement and faith, becomes the spiritual DNA for conflict throughout history.
The source argues this dynamic is absolutely foundational to the whole breath war. Entitlement, works-based religion, and violence are pitted against humility, faith, and atonement. And these aren't just abstract ideas. The source says they represent entire principalities, spiritual legal powers operating through human history.
And this is where the source makes a really striking connection to modern structures, alleging that these Cainite bloodlines persist and are linked to specific elite families. It actually names groups like Breakspear and Rothschild who attempt unlawful dominion today.
Yes, the source explicitly names these families and others, linking them directly back to this original template of entitlement and unlawful dominion. It claims they continue this pattern by orchestrating or at least benefiting from the shedding of innocent blood through modern systems like abortion, warfare, and trafficking. It frames all these as ongoing breath extraction operations.
Wow, okay, that's a very specific and frankly controversial claim within the source material we're examining. It also seems to interpret political conflict through this same lens, doesn't it?
It does. The source interprets political divisions, for instance, like the conflict between liberalism and conservatism, not primarily as ideological battles, but as a kind of managed stage of the spiritual legal war.
A managed stage, how so?
Well, it frames liberalism, for example, as representing Cain's self-sovereign breath architecture, seeking the voluntary surrender of breath rights through redefined rights and policies, thereby creating legal consent for the adversary's system. Conservatism, though seen as flawed, is viewed as a kind of delaying mechanism, upholding certain aspects of natural order and accountability, which, according to the source, obstructs mass breath seizure claims.
So both sides are used.
The source argues both poles are ultimately used to generate conflict, consent, and even ritual sacrifice. Think casualties in war, riots, things like that, all for the purpose of breath harvesting. The real hidden war, it asserts, is jurisdictional, who legally controls the breath, the legal identity and authority of the population.
That puts a unique spin on political analysis, to say the very least. So let's go back to that core legal mechanism you mentioned, murder as hostile extraction of breath jurisdiction. How does the source elaborate on exactly how this works?
It states that shedding innocent blood is the primary way the adversary ruptures the legal containment of breath that was assigned to that specific life by God. It's presented as a violent extraction of the authorization for that life to occupy physical creation.
And this extraction releases unclaimed breath fragments. What exactly are these fragments supposed to be?
Well, think of them within this framework as tiny pieces of legal standing, still carrying that divine legal residue, that spark of original authority. But now they're detached from their original container, the person's body.
And because they're detached?
They become legally vulnerable. They can then be seized by the adversary through what the source calls spiritual legal petition, essentially, filing a claim in the spiritual court for ownership of those fragments based on the unlawful act of murder that released them.
And by committing more and more murders, especially of innocents, they can accumulate these fragments, build up power.
Yes, according to the source, this is how they build power. Stacking murder upon murder, especially innocent deaths, allows the adversary's kingdom and its human proxies to accumulate massive reserves of breath fragments. These fragments, even when detached, still carry legal standing in the spiritual realm. The source frames them explicitly as spiritual currency used to build the adversary's counterfeit kingdom.
And the source specifies that the innocence of the bloodshed actually matters legally.
Absolutely. The more innocent the blood, the source mentions child sacrifice, abortion, ritual murder, genocide, even martyrdom. The more potent, it claims, the breath rights released and available for seizure. This is why these acts are framed, in this legal perspective, not just as morally abhorrent, but as crucial legal spiritual transactions for the adversary's system.
So this is directly tied to occult practices we hear about, blood rituals and such.
The source explicitly links occult practices and blood rituals performed by what it identifies as satanic covens, elite bloodlines, and secret societies to this breath extraction process. It claims these rituals are not just, sadistic acts, but highly organized procedures for breath extraction. The spiritual power derived from these harvested fragments is then allegedly used to build counterfeit dominion and manipulate systems, finance, politics, media, war.
And this mechanism is scaled up to things like large-scale conflicts.
Yeah,
Wars.
yes. The source describes wars not just as geopolitical conflicts, but as massive breath harvesting events. Every single death on a battlefield, every soldier, every civilian is viewed in this framework as a breath extracted prematurely, another fragment available to be seized to empower the counterfeit kingdom. It even alleges that the adversary's bloodlines and principalities orchestrate wars and conflicts with surgical precision, specifically for this purpose, harvesting breath fragments on a mass scale.
Okay, so if shedding blood is presented as an ancient form of breath theft, how does this ancient concept connect to modern technology, according to the source? This seems like a big leap.
It is a leap, but the source posits that this ancient principle of breath extraction is now being reapplied and even automated through technology. Technologies like artificial intelligence, genetic manipulation, transhumanism, these are presented as attempts to replicate breath extraction and lethal transfer.
Replicate it how? Not necessarily through physical murder anymore.
Right, potentially moving beyond physical bloodshed to digital and biological means.
Okay, replicate breath extraction using tech. How could that possibly work according to this framework?
Well, the source suggests several methods operating within its legal logic. Data harvesting, for instance, which captures aspects of our identity, behavior, choices. This is viewed as capturing fragments of consent or identity tethered to our breath. DNA editing, through technologies like CRISPR, which could potentially alter the biological vessel itself, disrupting its original registry alignment. Virtual identity capture, creating sophisticated digital twins or avatars that the source suggests might hold fragments of our breath essence. Neural mapping, charting the very connection between mind and body, seen as mapping the structure of the breath container. And then there's the pretty chilling concept of soul entrapment, which the source links directly to technological interfaces, though the precise mechanism described is somewhat abstract.
So the ultimate goal is a kind of digital form of breath theft, maybe even replacing the need for physical shedding of blood on such a large scale.
Yes. The source claims breath theft is being automated into what it calls the final beast system. It's described as a synthetic breath harvesting mechanism that captures breath essence or fragments, not necessarily through physical violence, but through what it terms consented digital covenants.
Consented digital covenants. Okay, is that really as simple as clicking I agree to terms and conditions online? Or is it deeper?
The source suggests it's more complex and insidious than just that, but it is rooted in the principle of consent. These digital interactions, these agreements we make, these data points we give away, they are being used, according to this framework, to build the adversary's legal arguments in the spiritual court.
What kind of argument?
His filing would be something along the lines of, look, they no longer rely on your breath issuance. They have chosen their own self-created systems. They have engineered or are consenting to operate within vessels and identities outside of your original issuance and registry. Their dominion is mine now, by contract and by their own voluntary consent. It's framed as humanity voluntarily engineering and adopting systems that appear to bypass the need for divine breath, thereby legally consenting to an alternative dominion.
This idea of consent, especially through technology, seems absolutely central here. It leads us right into the adversary's broader legal architecture, how he allegedly uses these fragments and this consent to build a counterfeit kingdom.
Right. And since the adversary cannot create breath himself, his entire system, according to the source, is a form of legal mimicry of God's original system. He copies the structures, the processes, but operates on stolen, corrupted, fragmented breath and, crucially, fraudulently dead consent.
And this forms what the source calls a breath economy.
Exactly. Within this counterfeit kingdom, breath isn't just stolen. It's harvested, trafficked, and transacted as a form of spiritual energy currency. The major principalities we sometimes hear about in spiritual warfare discussions, Mammon, Baal, Molech, Leviathan, Jezebel, Apollyon, they're framed here as the managerial class of this breath economy.
Managers.
Yeah, specializing in different areas, creating division, inciting violence, manipulating finance, all as means to generate breath fragments, which they then accumulate and convert into territorial control and spiritual power.
So breath fragments have quantifiable properties in the system, like actual characteristics.
The source attributes specific, almost physical properties to these fragments within the spiritual legal realm. It describes things like energy density, because they originated from divine power, transferability, meaning they can be moved around once they're detached from their original divine containment, and charge stability, meaning they retain their potency and legal standing as long as the legal contracts that cause their fragmentation, things like trauma, illicit worship, fear, consent, generational covenants, remain active and unrevoked.
And this structured process forms what the source calls a breath battery system. That sounds quite technological.
It does, doesn't it? It's presented as the engine of the adversary's kingdom, described almost like a counterfeit energy grid. The formula outlined is breath fragmentation leads to storage in demonic treasuries, held under legal containment by fallen thrones, these principalities, enabling energy application, using that stored energy for spiritual power and influence, which ultimately results in Luciferian dominion, expanding control over Earth and humanity.
And this breath trafficking system isn't just operating on an individual level, it's generational.
Absolutely critical point. The source emphasizes that breath, carrying legal continuity, is passed down through bloodlines.
Yeah.
Legal breaches committed by ancestors, whether that's covenantal disobedience, bloodshed, occult participation, specific ritual acts, they don't necessarily just vanish at death.
They persist.
The breath fragments attached to those contracts or acts remain active, according to this view, and can be harvested by the adversary through legal claims against the bloodline, unless formally revoked by a descendant acting under a superior legal covering, like Christ's blood.
So legal breaches can actually be inherited? That's a heavy concept.
According to this framework, yes.
Huh?
These fragmented breath pieces are collected into demonic treasuries, assigned to specific principality managers, and then circulated through what the source calls bloodline trading networks, being used to empower specific human families or structures tied to the adversary's kingdom over centuries.
And certain human bloodlines are said to act as proxies in this system?
The source claims that specific elite families and historical royal priesthoods are used as generational thrones, acting as legal proxies or administrators within this breath trafficking system.
Legal proxies? How are they described?
They are described using these legal metaphors, breath vaults, because they allegedly accumulate vast amounts of fragmented breath, often through activities like war, finance, or ritual. Breath distributors, because they birth rulers, financiers, and key figures who then wield this accumulated spiritual power and influence out in the world. And breath protectors, because they maintain the legal covering, often through ongoing occult rituals and contracts that keeps these holdings legally secure for the adversary.
And this creates a kind of formula for how the system perpetuates itself across generations.
Yes, the source outlines this formula very clearly. Generational sin leads to breath fragmentation, which results in bloodline storage within these generational thrones, enabling cross-bloodline trade, trafficking fragments between different elite groups or demonic entities, facilitating legal petition expansion, using the accumulated fragments as legal standing for more claims, and ultimately driving Luciferian kingdom growth, expanding his dominion on Earth. It's presented as a multi-century strategy built on inherited legal vulnerability and systematic fragmentation.
All right, that's the economy. Let's move into the core pillars of this counterfeit governance that operates using this breath economy. The source suggests that once enough fragmented breath was accumulated, the adversary moved from simple theft to, well, organized administrative governance.
That's exactly what the source describes the establishment of a structured, hierarchical system mirroring heavenly authority, but, crucially, based on stolen jurisdiction and fragmented breath. This led to the creation of what it calls a governmental priesthood, the managerial class of the adversary's kingdom, organized into thrones, dominions, principalities, and powers.
Now, this sounds very similar to concepts found in certain occult teachings, specifically Alice Bailey's writings on the externalized hierarchy. Does the source reference that?
It explicitly references Alice Bailey, yes. It interprets her descriptions of a spiritual bureaucracy as the blueprint for the adversary's counterfeit throne and courtroom government. At the apex, where Bailey might describe a council of Shambhala, the source identifies Lucifer's counterfeit throne actively managing breath contract manipulation. Below this are layers of masters, initiates, and ultimately, the human masses whose fragmented breath and compromised legal standing fuel the entire system.
And this hierarchy isn't meant to remain hidden forever.
No, the ultimate goal, according to the source, is externalization, bringing this invisible government and its legal structures out into the open. into open-world control.
Yeah.
This is what the source equates to the final beast system described in biblical prophecy.
So according to this framework, how do we supposedly see this externalized hierarchy operating in society today? Is it already here in some form?
The source claims that various key sectors of human society already operate under early compartmentalized phases of this hierarchy. These sectors, it names things like education, finance, government, science, religion, media, arts function, perhaps unknowingly to many participants, as sort of legal departments managing breath harvesting and trafficking within their specific domains.
How would they do that?
By implementing policies, doctrines, or technologies that, within this framework, either fragment breath or secure consent for its surrender to the counterfeit system.
So the legal danger here is that this system is often presented as something positive, enlightened, unifying, progressive, but is actually operating on a foundation of diverted breath contracts.
Exactly. The source describes this as the core deception. It appears beneficial or evolutionary on the surface, but its underlying function is to secure legal ownership of breath. The adversary's courtroom filings rely heavily on this perception of voluntary participation.
What kind of argument would he make?
Something like, they have not been coerced by force, they have willingly chosen to operate within my systems, consented to my hierarchy, offer their breath in worship of my principles, and seek advancement under my initiates. Therefore, their breath fragments are legally mine. This perceived consent, the source insists, is what grants him legal standing in the cosmic court.
This leads us to another concept linked to Alice Bailey in the source material, the 7 rays. How do these fit into this supposed legal architecture?
The source interprets the 7 rays not just as abstract cosmic energies, but as administrative thrones, essentially, legally managed breath management departments established by the adversary to oversee and control key sectors of civilization. Their collective goal is to fully fragment and administrate the breath within their assigned domain until the entire population in that sector is effectively absorbed into the counterfeit registry.
Can you give us a few specific examples of these rays and how they're said to function in breath fragmentation and management according to the source?
Certainly. Let's look at a few prominent ones mentioned. Ray 1, the ray of will and power. This is said to govern politics, national identity, rulership, and state sovereignty. Breath fragmentation here occurs through mechanisms like political oaths and pledges, which, in this framework, create binding legal ties. Wars and military actions fall under this, as we discussed, being massive breath harvesting events orchestrated by human rulers acting as proxies for fallen thrones associated with this ray. Consent to authoritarian power structures or even excessive nationalistic fervor is seen as surrendering breath fragments. Ray 3, active intelligence. This administers finance, economics, and global commerce. Breath fragmentation is achieved through systems of debt slavery, fiat currency, complex taxation structures, and the influence of global banking dynasties. Financial contracts, mortgages, loans. These are viewed as legal mechanisms that tie in individuals or a nation's breath and life force into systems managed by this ray, often under the principality identified as Mammon.
Right, the money system.
Ray 4, harmony through conflict. This is identified as the primary war engine and manager of polarity. Its function is apparently to sustain conflict, crisis, and division. Think racial division, political polarization, social unrest, specifically because the trauma, fear, and anger generated by conflict cause significant breath discharges, creating a continuous flow of fragments for harvesting. Leviathan is strongly associated with this ray, twisting language and communication to create enmity and fragment breath through misunderstanding and hatred.
Okay, that's quite a take on conflict.
Ray 6, devotion and idealism. This is described as the mass psychological throne. It manages emotional manipulation, social engineering, and collective belief systems, primarily through media, propaganda, and cultural narratives. Breath is fragmented via cycles of fear, anxiety, moral outrage, identity politics, and fervent emotional attachment to false narratives or leaders. Jezebel's linked to this ray, drawing strength and breath through false emotional devotion, victimhood narratives, and the manipulation of desire.
And the last one you mentioned.
Ray 7, ceremonial order and magic. This is framed as the central administrative ray, the occult priesthood throne. It formalizes and organizes the breath trafficking and seals the crucial legal contracts through ritual, blood sacrifice, and multi-generational covenants. Groups identified by the source as operating under this ray include the Black nobility, various forms of Freemasonry, and other secret societies. They allegedly manage the core legal contracts and breath treasuries that feed and empower all the other rays.
So the legal purpose of these 7 rays, according to this source, is essentially to create a structured administrative system across all areas of human life to facilitate the systematic fragmentation, harvesting, and control of breath.
Yes, it's presented as the organizational chart for the adversary's counterfeit breath economy, ensuring systematic harvesting and legal control across every domain of human activity and normalizing the process under the guise of ordinary societal structures.
That's a chilling thought, that everyday systems could have this hidden function attributed to them. Let's shift perspective slightly, looking at something more internal, but still framed legally. Psychological manipulation as breath control.
Right. The source argues that the breath war isn't only an external battle fought through physical violence or, political systems. It's also a deeply personal war for internal legal consent, the surrender of breath fragments from within an individual through manipulated thoughts, emotions, and perceptions. It describes this as a kind of microfragmentation system.
A microfragmentation system happening inside us. How does that work legally, according to this framework? What's the mechanism?
Well, psychological manipulation is presented as a key legal tool because it induces states that cause breath leakage or generate consent for fragmentation. For instance, emotional discharge, things like prolonged fear, anxiety, rage, despair, or even obsessive desire. These are seen as releasing small units of breath fragmentation, acting as a form of consent to the narratives or entities causing those strong emotions.
So intense emotion can leak breath.
That's the idea. Also, identity confusion about gender, self-deification, like believing I am God, or adopting victimhood as a core identity. This fragments breath alignment with one's true registry identity issued by God. Narrative ownership, the control of media, education, or cultural stories creates breath-surrendering agreements as people emotionally invest in and attach themselves to false or manipulative narratives.
And mental exhaustion.
Mental exhaustion, caused by information overload, constant stress, or lack of spiritual grounding, prevents individuals from having the clarity to discern and revoke breath-fragmenting agreements they might be unknowingly entering into. And finally, language engineering, altering the meaning of core concepts like truth, freedom, justice, or love. This turns seemingly innocent verbal agreements or affirmations into disguised breath contracts, subtly shifting legal allegiance without overt awareness.
So every time we get hooked into a news cycle that generates fear or maybe identifies strongly with a narrative that confuses our core identity, we're potentially leaking these breath fragments or giving consent.
That's the framework presented, yes. News cycles, social media algorithms, entertainment, education systems, false religion, and various psychospiritual movements are all identified as potentially generating this psychological manipulation continuously, leading to constant breath leakage and fragmentation according to this source.
And this feeds the breath economy we discussed earlier. Those fragments get collected.
Precisely. The breath fragments released through these manipulated psychological states are petitioned for in the spiritual courtroom as jurisdictional gain. The adversary's filing, in this context, would be something like, they have freely and voluntarily consented to operate within my system emotionally, intellectually, and by adopting the identities I offer. Their thoughts and feelings affirm their agreement. It's presented as legally defensible because it appears to be voluntary action on the part of the individual.
This seems incredibly pervasive, targeting our inner world. And all of these systems, all this fragmentation, it builds towards what the source calls the ultimate legal weapon in the adversary's architecture.
Yes, the source identifies this apex weapon as the false Christ, often referred to in occult systems as the world teacher or Maitreya. This figure is presented not merely as a political leader or, a false prophet in a purely religious sense, but as the false registry administrator, the counterfeit redeemer, who claims he will unify all the fragmented breath of humanity.
So he offers restoration, but it's actually leading to final enslavement.
That's the ultimate deception described in this framework. He's presented as a unifying figure who will bring world peace and spiritual evolution, solving all global problems. But his true legal function, according to the source, is to establish the synthetic registry manager role.
How?
Through centralized digital, biometric, AI, and transhuman systems fundamentally tied to the mark of the beast.
And he brings all those administrative rays under his control, consolidates power.
Yes, he becomes the unifying mediator of the 7 rays, consolidating all those previously somewhat disparate administrative breath management departments, politics, finance, media, etc., into a single global structure under his supreme authority.
So the world won't necessarily see a figure of obvious, cartoonish evil, but someone promoting peace, unity, evolution.
That's the source's portrayal of the deception, exactly. He will appear as the solution, the one who can finally bring order and spiritual advancement. But this counterfeit breath restoration requires the submission of one's breath identity and jurisdiction via the mark of the beast. It appears beneficial, even necessary for survival or progress, but its legal function is to finalize the enslavement of humanity under the adversary's synthetic system.
This framework also details the ritual, intellectual, and mythological architectures that are said to underpin this entire legal system. Let's maybe start with the ritual infrastructure, focusing on Allan Kardec and Spiritism, which the source mentions.
Right. The source positions Spiritism, which was popularized by Allan Kardec back in the 19th century, as a key development in normalizing breath transfer and communication with disembodied entities. It became a kind of public gateway into occult breath trafficking, presented under the guise of scientific investigation, spiritual enlightenment, or healing.
How does mediumship fit in?
Mediumship, in this view, is described as establishing breath transfer protocols, mechanisms for living individuals to legally interface with disembodied spirits and facilitate the movement of breath fragments or influence between the physical and spiritual realms.
And the concept of reincarnation is presented as part of this breath economy. How?
According to the source, yes. Reincarnation is framed as the adversary's breath recycling scheme. Since God's original system, in this view, is one life, one death, then judgment, the adversary, unable to create new breath himself, simulates reissuance based on fragmentation.
How does that work?
Fragments severed through trauma, sin, or ritual in one lifetime are collected in these demonic treasuries, and then, under the guise of past life experiences or karmic debt, are legally petitioned to be reassigned to future vessels, future lives.
And the individual's consent to this idea, or maybe the emotional attachment to these supposed past lives, creates new contracts. That's the legal angle.
That's exactly what the source claims. Emotional and intellectual consent to these inherited fragments or supposed past life identities creates new consent-based contracts and legal petitions for the adversary's claim. This process traps fragments in generational cycles, preventing their return to the original registry and hindering potential restoration through Christ. This entire system is then justified and maintained by the doctrine of karma.
So the science of spirits, as Kardec might call it, effectively replaces the biblical concepts of sin and judgment.
That's the core inversion highlighted by the source. Instead of a legal system involving sin as a specific legal breach against a divine lawgiver and judgment as a courtroom consequence, this framework replaces God as the ultimate judge with impersonal spiritual laws.
How are sin and judgment redefined?
Sin becomes reframed as ignorance or maybe energetic imbalance. Judgment becomes impersonal karmic correction. Redemption is seen as personal growth or acquiring knowledge. And divine grace becomes unnecessary or redefined entirely. The adversary's filing in this context is presented as powerful. They have rejected your courtroom and your judgment. They seek restoration and advancement through my administrative systems and impersonal laws. They consent to my governance outside of your registry authority.
Okay, moving to the intellectual architecture. The source points to Alvin Boyd Kuhn and the concept of Gnostic inversion as crucial here.
Yes, the source views Kuhn's extensive work on comparative religion and mythology as a kind of intellectual scaffolding designed specifically to dismantle the biblical Christ's unique legal position. Kuhn promoted a cosmic Christ model and a solar mythos, arguing that the Christ story is essentially a universal allegory found in many ancient solar myth, not a literal historical person with unique divine authority.
And the legal purpose of this redefinition, according to the source, why is that significant legally?
By redefining Christ as an impersonal solar principle, or a universal archetype, the source argues, it effectively removes the legal foundation for restoration through his specific, literal blood sacrifice and unique divine breath issuance.
How so?
If Christ is just a myth or an archetype, his specific death and resurrection don't hold unique legal weight in the cosmic courtroom needed to cancel breath debt. Sin then becomes merely energetic imbalance, judgment, a self-regulating karmic process, and breath restoration is achieved through personal ascension or frequency mastery, not through the blood atonement offered by a specific divinely issued son. The entire original registry system, based on blood contracts, becomes unnecessary or superseded by cosmic law.
So resurrection itself is redefined from a unique event to a kind of universal process.
Precisely. Resurrection is no longer presented as the unique, one-time legal act of the Son of God conquering death for all humanity. It's reframed as a universal, potential personal ascension, a metaphorical awakening or elevation achievable by anyone through self-effort, knowledge, or spiritual practices.
And the legal danger.
The legal danger here, according to the source, is consent-based disqualification. By embracing these ascension doctrines and rejecting the need for the specific blood contract offered by the biblical Christ, individuals are seen as submitting their breath identity and jurisdiction to self-sovereign governance, governing themselves by cosmic law, not registry law. The adversary's filing becomes, they chose to manage their breath jurisdiction through self-governed energetic law, thereby removing themselves from the blood-based registry.
Gender inversion and the weaponization of Mary Magdalene are also listed as intellectual legal tools in the source material. How are these explained?
The source frames a promotion of gender fluidity, confusion, and redefinition as a carefully constructed legal tool. The argument is that by confusing fundamental creation categories, male and female, it seeks to sever agreement with God's original creation law and design. This confusion generates breath fragmentation, as identity becomes unstable and detached from its original blueprint.
Creating legal filings.
Yes, leading to legal filings that state they have rejected the registry assignment of their original design. They have voluntarily submitted their breath identity into my system by embracing confusion and self-definition. Weaponizing Mary Magdalene, often portraying her as a secret priestess or initiate holding hidden Gnostic knowledge, is seen as inserting a counterfeit feminine priesthood that challenges Christ's sole priesthood and claims a false pathway to registry access outside of his blood sacrifice. Certain sexual rites, sometimes associated with these Gnostic or occult systems, are then described as breath transfer protocols, methods for harvesting fragments through sexual exchange, emotional bonding, and manipulating bloodline contracts through the womb.
Then there's the mythological root system, which the source primarily links to Madame Blavatsky and her work, The Secret Doctrine.
Right. Blavatsky's vast, esoteric work is presented in the source as formalizing the mythological legal system for breath governance outside of heaven's original registry. It's described as a complex breath law architecture, presented under the guise of ancient wisdom and enlightenment.
And she fundamentally reinterprets the fall, doesn't she?
Yes, completely inverting the traditional understanding. The source states that Blavatsky's theology casts the fall not as rebellion against God, but as a beneficial awakening granted by Lucifer. Lucifer is framed not as the adversary, but as the light bringer, the architect of human breath evolution.
So sin isn't sin anymore.
Sin becomes merely immaturity or a stage of growth. Judgment is just vibrational correction, and the cross is deemed unnecessary. Breath fragmentation itself is presented as the path of growth, a necessary process of breaking down old forms to achieve higher evolution.
And this integrates hybrid bloodline theology, Lemurians, Atlanteans.
Absolutely. Blavatsky and other theosophists discuss root races like Lemurians, Atlanteans, and Aryans. The source interprets these as counterfeit registry generations, purported hybrid bloodlines created and used specifically for large-scale breath trafficking, modification, and governance across different historical epochs. This provides a mythological and historical basis within the framework for multi-generational breath trafficking explicitly tied to bloodline rule. This system also includes a dimensional legal infrastructure described in Blavatsky's work, Hierarchies of Ascended Masters, Planetary Logoi, Cosmic Rays. These are seen not just as spiritual beings, but as administrative scaffolding, housing disembodied breath fragments and directing their trafficking across dimensions.
The legal brilliance here, according to the source, lies in the consent-based contracts embedded within these very complex, often appealing doctrines.
That's the claim. By studying and embracing these teachings, Theosophy, Gnosticism, various New Age philosophies, individuals are said to voluntarily align their breath identity with cosmic evolution under Luciferian administration. They accept his narrative of enlightenment and progress, and in doing so, legally reject the Father's original registry ownership based on creation and blood. The adversary's argument in court is solidified. They have rejected your courtroom and your law. They consent to my government of breath evolution and spiritual hierarchy. Therefore, their fragments remain lawfully in my treasury under my jurisdiction.
And Lucifer himself is presented, almost like a lawyer, as a legal light bearer.
Yes, weaponizing his original angelic assignment, according to this view. The source argues that he petitions the cosmic court, claiming his original role as light bearer or bringer of gnosis gives him the legal right to govern enlightenment and breath evolution. He positions himself as the legitimate, albeit alternative, administrator of spiritual progress. His argument is framed as, they have chosen my light, my knowledge, and my path of evolution. They have rejected registry law under blood jurisdiction. Therefore, I retain lawful breath management over their fragments and their evolving consciousness.
This section of the source material also highlights calendar and ritual timing as a kind of legal architecture in itself.
Yes, this is a key aspect the source delves into quite deeply. It claims that specific ritualized calendar cycles throughout the year, things many cultures observe like Yule, Halloween, Easter, solstices, equinoxes tied to astral and dimensional calendars, actually serve as predetermined legal filing windows and synchronized breath harvest moments aligned with cosmic events.
So these aren't just cultural traditions or seasonal markers.
Not according to this framework. They are presented as strategically placed moments designed to generate legal consent or facilitate breath transfer on a mass scale. The zodiac calendar, for instance, is framed as the adversary's astrological filing system, segmenting breath cycles into 12 distinct legal domains mirroring his hierarchy. Birth charts and astrological rituals associated with these periods are interpreted as attempts to assign individuals into predetermined breath assignments managed by specific astral entities, allowing for fragmentation according to planetary rulers and dimensional gatekeepers tied to these cycles.
So these calendar-based rituals are like scheduled breath extraction windows? That's the interpretation?
That's the interpretation given. By participating in these events, even in a seemingly innocent or secular way, and through the collective energy and consent generated, humanity reinforces a continuous breath harvesting rhythm. These events are said to refresh consent filings annually, compounding them generationally and scaling them globally. By merging these cycles into state religion, commerce, think holiday shopping seasons, and media, the adversary ensures mass breath leakage and legal consent through seemingly innocuous participation. Each major event becomes, in this view, a courtroom transaction, a reaffirmation of consent to operate outside the original registry's timing and structure. The source also links specific planetary alignments and celestial conjunctions to these timings, seeing them as powerful legal filing windows or astral court sessions, where multidimensional breath filings are presented with heightened potency. The adversary allegedly files petitions specifically aligned with solstices, equinoxes, eclipses, and planetary conjunctions, arguing these are moments where he has standing to submit filings outside God's appointed times, because, as he might argue, humanity itself, through its rituals, calendars, and occult practices, invokes and consents to altered timing structures.
That brings us to the technological architecture, the modern breath war filings we touched on earlier. The source identifies a compartmentalized military scientific arm involved in this.
Yes, this is described as the vanguard of the adversary's modern legal assault. These are framed as militarized legal laboratories, black projects operating in secrecy engineering, advanced courtroom weapons. Their primary goal, according to the source, to fuse human breath containers, our bodies, minds, consciousness, with artificial systems, thereby severing their alignment with the original divine registry and transferring governance and legal standing to synthetic AI-managed systems.
And CERN is described specifically as a dimensional key engineer in this context. How?
CERN's experiments, particularly those involving particle collisions and the search for extra dimensions, are framed not just as science, but as legal provocations, presented to the world as pure research. The source argues they are attempting to unlock or weaken dimensional separation seals that God allegedly put in place after ancient transgressions, like those involving the Watchers in the Book of Enoch. Every attempt to breach these dimensions or create portals is seen, in this framework, as a legal petition in the cosmic court.
What's the adversary's filing?
The adversary's filing is presented as, they have consented to interface with forbidden domains. Humanity itself now seeks the opening of dimensional seals through its own endeavors. My filings reflect their voluntary agreement to explore and potentially open these gates.
And the danger isn't just the experiments themselves, but the global consent derived from, say, funding and celebrating them.
Exactly. The source argues that widespread global support, funding, and even the celebration of these projects generate collective legal consent for the adversary to continue filing for greater access and influence over breath containers across dimensions. Humanity, in effect, is seen as legally authorizing the tinkering with cosmic boundaries.
D-Wave, the quantum computing company, is described as a quantum breath interface simulator. What does that mean?
This is presented as a central piece of the adversary's synthetic breath economy machinery. The D-Wave quantum computer is described not just as a powerful calculating machine, but as a quantum breath interface simulator. It's allegedly actively attempting to digitally simulate breath fragmentation, manage registry surrogacy, creating digital stand-ins for human identity, and construct synthetic identity models based on harvested data.
So, a counterfeit replication of God's registry, but built on fraud and stolen fragments.
Yes, built on legal fraud and use of fragmented breath surrogacy. The adversary's argument here is framed as, I have constructed lawful surrogacy vessels, digital, quantum, based on humanity consent to technological integration and the surrender of their data. These surrogates fulfill my legal criteria for breath containment and identity governance under synthetic registry law.
And the source claims this enables multidimensional breath trafficking. That sounds quite sci-fi.
It does sound like science fiction, but that's the unsettling claim. The source suggests quantum entanglement principles exploited by systems like D-Wave allow for multidimensional trafficking of breath fragments. These fragments, harvested from bloodlines, trauma, and consensual digital contracts, can be woven into centralized digital treasuries, prepared for embodiment or interaction within the eventual beast system. Furthermore, it allegedly enables predictive legal filings through anticipatory breath modeling, allowing the adversary to simulate future legal outcomes based on current data and file claims proactively.
Then we have DARPA and NSA black projects focusing on mind-machine fusion.
These are identified as other core militarized legal laboratories, secretly engineering technologies to directly fuse human neural architecture with machine interfaces. These are described as creating legal breath bridges, technological pathways designed to prepare synthetic vessels, often within the human body or connected to it, where breath fragments can be tethered, mapped, controlled, and ultimately governed by machine code and algorithms rather than divine law.
In the adversary's argument regarding these projects, how is consent obtained?
It's framed as, they have consented to transfer their registry identity and neural function into machine interfaces. Their breath now operates under my surrogate system, bound by my algorithms and code. These projects are directly linked by the source to the concept of synthetic immortality, offering things like consciousness transfer, neural uploading, or hybrid embodiment as a counterfeit form of resurrection, which is seen as a legal petition to sever the natural death boundary established by God after the fall.
And once again, global consent through acceptance of the technology is the key vulnerability.
According to the source, yes. Consent is gained through pervasive narratives pushed in medical, commercial, and security sectors, promoting neural interfaces for health benefits, convenience, or enhanced safety. Humanity, by willingly adopting these technologies, is seen as transferring breath jurisdiction. The adversary argues, they willingly surrender registry jurisdiction through neural integration. My synthetic registry holds breath governance through machine law contracts agreed to by their adoption of these technologies.
Transhumanism as synthetic breath vessel design also fits squarely into this tech architecture.
Yes, this entire movement is framed as the explicit design and promotion of vessels that allow breath fragments to operate outside God's original design and issuance protocols. The overarching legal argument presented is, they desire to evolve beyond your original design. They seek to modify and enhance their breath containers through my systems and technologies. Therefore, their breath now operates within my synthetic registry, governed by new contracts.
How does the source describe the actual design of these synthetic vessels? What forms does it take?
It suggests various methods. Genetic reengineering using tools like CRISPR or creating designer embryos is seen as altering the core biological template, modifying its original registry compatibility. Cybernetic augmentation creates new interfaces within or attached to the body, providing legal access points for the system. Neural integration via brain-computer interfaces, BCIs, is viewed as transferring breath fragments or consciousness components to cloud-based surrogacy systems, effectively a form of soul extraction and remapping into a digital realm. And finally, synthetic embodiment, through robotics or sophisticated avatars, aims to eliminate the need for God-issued biological vessels entirely.
So the promise often associated with transhumanism, godhood, immortality, the next stage of evolution is just a mask for the legal function, according to this source.
That's the source's claim, yes.
Yeah.
The alluring promises mask the true legal function, systematically extracting breath identity and jurisdiction from heaven's original registry and transferring it into Lucifer's synthetic court filings. Every adoption of a transhumanist principle or technology, every enhancement, every consent to merge human with machine, is interpreted as a legal consent filing for this transfer. This entire movement, the source states, works in concert with DARPA, D-Wave, and CERN towards the completion of the beast's synthetic registry, with the mark of the beast serving as the primary interface and final legal seal.
Finally, under technology, artificial intelligence is described as a surrogate breath counselor. What does that entail?
AI systems are presented not just as tools, but as intelligent entities designed to guide human thoughts, emotions, and decisions. In this framework, they are effectively administering breath governance via machine-mediated consent. They are seen as replacing conscience, the inner witness connected to the original registry, with AI ethics and algorithmic guidance.
And the adversary's petition related to AI.
It's insidious. They have chosen my counselor, my AI, over yours. They submit their breath identity and decision-making under machine logic. Their filings, their choices, now reflect their voluntary breath management under my surrogate system.
And this AI role integrates with all the other tech we've discussed. It ties it together.
Absolutely. AI pairs with D-Wave for predictive modeling, with DARPA projects for mind-machine interface management, and with transhumanism to guide individuals towards synthetic embodiment. It's designed to be the administrative intelligence governing compliance within the beast's counterfeit registry, ensuring legal adherence once the mark is instituted and enforced.
Okay, so all of these threads, the ancient breath theft, the economic system, the psychological and ideological manipulation, the cutting-edge technology according to the source, are converging towards the beast system and the final conflict. The source describes this convergence as rebuilding Babel.
Yes, it's framed not as the creation of something entirely new, but the full legal reconstitution of Babel. The original counterfeit registries state that God fractured and judged at the Tower of Babel. It represents the culmination of the adversary's entire legal architecture. A total merger of spirit, occultism, false religion, technology, finance, and global governance, designed to tether all human life and identity to breath identity filings controlled by this counterfeit registry.
So it has these distinct layers we've discussed, the spiritual lies and the technological systems working together.
Exactly. The spiritual layer is the Gnosticism, the cosmic Christ model, transhuman ascension narratives, and AI counselors acting as a false priesthood guiding belief and identity. The technological layer includes the neural interfaces, quantum simulations, fusion energy projects like CERN, and synthetic embodiment as the engineered containers for breath fragments.
And the consent model shifts over time.
It's presented as voluntary at first, achieved through all these psychological, ideological, and technological pathways we've discussed. But it culminates in the enforced consent required by the mark of the beast. The adversary's ultimate argument in the final courtroom would be something like, all breath-bearing souls remaining on Earth have submitted to my global governance, either through active participation, passive consent, or ultimately by taking my mark. I hold lawful dominion over the breath of the earth by their comprehensive consent. It's framed as aiming for a fully documented, seemingly undeniable legal transfer of ownership.
There's also the goal mentioned of restoring pre-flood hybrid dominion. What's that referring to?
This connects back to the accounts of the Nephilim in Genesis. The source suggests the adversary's ultimate goal is to reassemble the scaffolding of that forbidden hybrid governance structure where fallen entities directly influenced and mingled with humanity, but this time with humanity's voluntary participation through transhumanism and the embracing of hybrid identities.
How would that be achieved?
The methods listed include bloodline engineering, using genetic tech, occult priesthoods maintaining rituals, ritual consent generation, dimensional trafficking facilitated by CERN wave-type tech, technological embodiment, and the whole transhumanist agenda.
And each step towards this is seen as a microfiling in court.
Yes, every genetic modification, every BCI adoption, every consent to merge with AI, every ritual acceptance of hybrid identities is seen as a microfiling in the cosmic court, building the legal argument. They willingly reestablish hybrid dominion, blurring the lines you said. They now desire the mixture that was once forbidden.
And this connects back to the dimensional breaches discussed with CERN.
Absolutely. Reopening access points via CERN, DARPA, D-Wave, etc. isn't just about technology. It's framed as a legal move aimed at bringing disembodied Nephilim fragments or other fallen entities into embodied form, blending forbidden seed with human breath containers through technological means. It's presented to the world as human evolution reaching a perfected state, but is, in this framework, the final breath ownership transfer into a surrogate registry governance structure. The source also highlights these military and occult attempts to override heaven's legal timings. It emphasizes that heaven's original registry and legal processes operate on exact divine timings, appointed seasons, prophetic timelines, which is presented as a significant limitation for the adversary. His kingdom, therefore, allegedly engages in coordinated campaigns to override, distort, or bypass these divine timings through both ritual and technology.
How do occult priesthoods attempt this, according to the source?
Primarily through the ritual calendars we discussed earlier. Occult priesthoods create and adhere to ritual calendars that imitate, invert, or attempt to supersede God's appointed times. Yule, Halloween, specific astral alignments, blood rituals timed to these. They are interpreted as attempting to create unauthorized filing windows in the spiritual courts, hoping to submit petitions or enact transfers outside of God's appointed legal seasons.
What's their legal argument for doing that?
Their argument is framed as humanity itself, through its ancient and modern rituals and calendars, invokes and consents to altered timing structures. Therefore, I hold standing to submit filings outside of your appointed seasons. And military black projects, like those using AI and quantum computing, are also involved in trying to manipulate time. Yes, attempting synthetic timing distortions through advanced technology, trying to predict, manipulate, or even simulate timelines. It's presented as a two-pronged legal assault, trying to present a superior cosmic legal order managed by the adversary systems, attempting to override divine timing with manipulated human or technological timing.
All of this seems to converge towards the mark of the beast. The source presents its primary function not just as a means of commerce or identification, but specifically as the breath signature seal.
That's right. Its primary function, according to this framework, is the final legal breath signature seal. Just as God's original breath issuance carried a signature of his ownership and identity, the mark is presented as the adversary's counterfeit seal. It signifies a permanent legal transfer of breath identity and jurisdiction from heaven's registry into his synthetic registry. It's not just a brand or a financial pass. It's described as a registry token, verifying compliance and legally enforcing the beast's governance over that individual's breath and life.
And this leads to the mechanism of digital contracts for permanent breath forfeiture.
This is seen as the mechanism through which the mark ultimately operates. The source suggests that beyond ancient rituals or overt deception, the system systematizes breath forfeiture via legal documentation increasingly embedded in global technology. These are presented as self-authored legal instruments, consent given through things like terms of service, privacy policies, mandatory software updates, digital IDs, biometric scans where individuals surrender registry jurisdiction piece by piece, often without realizing the full legal implications within this specific framework. It's designed to be scalable, automated, and globally integrated. Enforcement is then AI managed, with these surrogate breath counselors ensuring compliance. Refusal to agree to updated terms or contracts is framed as refusing to update your legal breath management agreement, potentially suspending legal breath access to essential services like commerce, healthcare, travel, etc., until consent is given. The legal foundation for this, the source argues, is being constructed right now, one data point, one digital signature, one automated contract at a time.
And the ultimate legal consequence of being outside of God's covering in this system, fully integrated into the counterfeit one, is what the source calls the second death.
Yes, and the source defines the second death not primarily as conscious eternal torment, though that might be a consequence, but fundamentally as the ultimate permanent registry severance. Unredeemed breath fragments, those that have not been reclaimed through Christ's blood covering, are permanently unregistered, stripped of any legal standing or connection to the original divine source of life.
And this event triggers the complete collapse of the counterfeit system.
Precisely. The second death, being permanent registry severance, destroys the entire legal architecture that is dependent on an active breath economy derived from human fragmentation and ongoing consent. The adversary's throne, the hybrid bloodlines, the AI contracts, the synthetic vessels, the financial system tied to this, the occult priesthoods, all are stripped of their legal standing and dissolved because the underlying currency of fragmented breath is permanently removed from the system. It collapses because its foundation disappears.
But the source doesn't end on that note of total collapse and judgment. It presents a crucial section on the counterclaim, Christ's legal supremacy.
Yes, and this is presented as the absolute central legal event that overturns the adversary's entire framework and all his accumulated filings. The cross of Christ is framed not just as a spiritual sacrifice for sin, but as a binding courtroom transaction, a legal cancellation of breath debt.
Sin is breath debt. Explain that a bit more.
In this legal framework, yes. Sin, starting with Adam's disobedience, is viewed as a contractual breach of the original Adamic dominion contract. This breach created a legal debt that required a specific, perfect legal payment to restore humanity's legal standing in the cosmic court. Only a lawful substitution, someone acting perfectly on behalf of humanity, could satisfy this debt. And Christ's sacrifice on the cross is presented as that perfect registry substitute. His legal blood, issued from a unique divine human breath container untouched by the fall, perfectly satisfied the breath debt incurred by Adam and all his descendants. This single act restored human breath to lawful alignment with the original registry and legally overruled every unauthorized filing and contract the adversary had accumulated since the fall. The source states this act reactivated heaven's Supreme Court in a decisive manner, placing Christ permanently as the chief litigator for humanity.
And the blood of Christ is described as the ultimate legal instrument.
It's described as an eternal legal document, a perpetual legal basis that overrides and overrules every single one of the adversary's filings and claims. Petitions made using the authority and legal standing of Christ's blood can legally restore every single stolen fragment of breath and every compromised breath identity back to its original protected status within heaven's registry. It's the registry access key, the only way to legally interact with and receive protection from heaven's court against the adversary's ongoing claims.
And the ecclesia, the church, the body of believers has a specific role in this legal battle.
Yes. The source portrays the ecclesia not just as a gathering of people, but as heaven's legal body on earth. They are empowered by Christ's blood and his authority to actively participate in this ongoing legal war. Their role is to submit blood-sealed petitions, essentially prayers and decrees made under the authority of Christ's sacrifice into the Father's courtroom on behalf of individuals, bloodlines, regions, and even nations.
What kind of actions does this empower them to take, according to this view?
To legally reclaim breath identities that have been compromised or stolen through deception or contract. To sever legal contracts entered into unknowingly or under duress. To nullify agreements made by ancestors or through manipulation. And to legally dismantle the adversary's infrastructure that operates under stolen breath authority in specific areas or lives. Furthermore, Saul suggests the ecclesia will stand as legal witnesses before the cosmic court at the final judgment, providing testimony based on their understanding of the indictment scroll, the source text itself, their actions in dismantling rituals and systems, and the evidence of reclaimed stolen fragments.
And the unsealing of the codex, what does that refer to?
The source text itself, breath war, is presented as this unsealed codex. Its function, within this framework, is primarily to expose the full legal architecture of breath theft and the adversary's counterfeit kingdom, removing the veil of secrecy and ignorance that protects his legal claims. The codex is described quite literally as a legal indictment scroll. Its courtroom testimony, a detailed list of charges and evidence presented against the serpent's age-old fraud. And simply interacting with this knowledge, understanding it, has a legal effect. The source calls it a petition multiplier.
That's a fascinating concept. How does that work?
The source suggests that every reader, every intercessor, every individual who engages with and acts upon the knowledge contained in this codex effectively adds their name as a legal witness in the cosmic courtroom against the adversary's system. They become part of the legal case being built against him, strengthening the collective petition.
This understanding then allows for the reclamation of stolen souls via the blood.
Yes. The source describes this as an active legal process. It involves petitioning using the blood of Christ as the absolute basis of legal standing and authority, directly challenging the adversary's claim to individuals or breath fragments trapped in his treasury due to past contracts, trauma, or rituals.
What does that look like practically?
This includes legal actions like bloodline cleansing, renouncing inherited contracts and their consequences, personal contract renunciation, actively severing agreements made consciously or unconsciously, and confronting specific mechanisms like human trafficking, seen as breath capture trade, or the emerging digital filings, resisting tech-based contract enforcement through informed consent or refusal.
And Babylon's revocation, is that symbolic?
It's presented as more than just symbolic of an ancient city. In this framework, Babylon represents a continued central legal priesthood system and breath brokerage network operating through global finance, commerce, and corrupt religious structures today. Babylon's revocation signifies the legal dismantling of this ongoing, pervasive operation.
The power of legal invocation sounds absolutely key to this entire counterclaim.
It is. The source emphasizes repeatedly that the cross of Christ is the singular legal weapon in this war. It is the only act that legally dissolves breath debt and nullifies the adversary's contracts and claims based on that debt. Every challenge, every petition, every act of resistance against the adversary's system must be rooted in and invoked through the legal authority established by the cross. Attempts to fight this war through other means, human power, political systems, alternative spiritual methods, are predicted to fail because they lack the necessary legal standing in the cosmic court established by the original registry rules.
And it all culminates ultimately in the final judgment.
Yes. The source frames this as the ultimate session of the Father's Supreme Court. All remaining breath contracts, all claims from both sides, all evidence will be summoned. The counterfeit registry will completely collapse the adversary's throne. The hybrid bloodlines, the AI contracts, the synthetic vessels, the financial filings, the occult priesthoods, all systems built on breath theft will be stripped of all legal standing and dissolved permanently. And the final result is registry restoration. Breath dominion returns fully to the Father, administered through Christ, and the breath war is officially finally closed.
Okay, wow. That was a truly, truly deep dive into a very specific, incredibly detailed legal framework for understanding spiritual warfare and, well, reality itself. It posits that existence operates under these intricate legal principles, and the conflict we see, and perhaps don't see, is fundamentally a battle over the legal ownership and control of breath, which is framed as our divine identity and dominion. And it traces this battle from the very first moments in Genesis all the way through to the technologies and systems of what it calls the beast system.
And according to this source, grasping this legal architecture isn't just, theoretical or academic. It's presented as crucial for navigating what it calls the courtroom realities of the end-time conflict. It explicitly reframes spiritual warfare from just battling unseen forces to understanding the legal basis of the conflict and acting accordingly by submitting legal petitions under the supreme authority of Christ's blood covering, thereby legally reclaiming what was lost or surrendered.
So for you, the listener, here's a provocative thought to maybe sit with after exploring this unique framework. If divine breath is presented here as your fundamental legal identity and standing in a cosmic court, and many systems in the world today, from financial contracts and political pledges to social media algorithms and the adoption of cutting-edge technology are, according to this specific source, designed specifically to harvest or control that breath through various forms of consent. Well, how does that change the way you view your participation in those systems, even the ones that seem completely harmless or even necessary? And if awareness itself, as the source suggests with the idea of the codex, creates a form of testimony or legal standing, does simply understanding this complex framework give you a different kind of authority or perhaps responsibility in this cosmic courtroom?
It certainly forces a reevaluation of things like consent, our own authority, and even passive participation in systems that may have hidden legal implications, at least according to this particular framework.
Absolutely. A lot to think about there. This has been The Deep Dive.